lineage, if you like, in the Cro-Magnons came to be if, say, for example, we're not seeing any evidence of it in, the Neanderthals or some of the early humans, very early primitive humans that came out of Africa. Why is it just this one? And this sort of opens it all up to the issue of like ancient astronauts and people like Zecharia Sitchin postulating that early humans may have been genetically manipulated to create sort of like a more robust human-type creature with intelligence that essentially could be used, as he saw it at least, as a slave race. So in other words, he felt that these anomalies in the human race and development and sort of spontaneous or near spontaneous eruptions of different types of humans in different parts of the world may not have been due to nature or the theory of evolution, but could have been by direct intervention, if you like, by aliens.
I'm fairly certain. I mean, I've encountered this idea previously in other forms and different fashion, but I'm sure other people have as well. But this is a slightly more, I think, attempt to like come to grips with some specifics about the situation, which I appreciate a little bit. So if we could maybe speculate, do you think that, I don't want to say aliens because I feel like it's such a loaded term, but, maybe, some other intelligences were manipulating humans or some other creature genetically, maybe Neanderthal, man, maybe something prior?
Well, yeah, I think I think you're right to be cautious on, a lot of this, because the further we go back in time, the sort of foggier everything becomes, you know what I mean? It's, if you look back sort of past Sumerian times and early Egypt, we really don't have too much, of an understanding of exactly what went on. There are a lot of gaps and mysteries when you start going back roughly more than sort of 8, 9, 10,000 BC, and and everything is sort of simplified. Cavemen living in caves with clubs and things like this, and it is very sort of simplified because we just don't know the full stories. But you can look in all sorts of different cultures and find, for example, situations where you have, the so-called gods coming down and trying to civilize the early types of humans. And, there's always that sort of genetic connection, like the gods taking human wives, or, somewhere you had demigods, which are sort of half human and half godlike. And like the biblical stories of Eve being made from Adam's rib and things like this. You can put all of these legends into a context of sort of genetic, high level, highly advanced genetic manipulation, gene splicing, that kind of thing. Obviously, the most prevalent theory is the extraterrestrial one, which, as you point out, is a very loaded one. On the other hand, there's theories have been put forward that what if they were early, highly advanced humans, a strain of the human race that destroyed itself or became extinct for whatever reason, that competed and lived alongside the early cavemen, so to speak, but they were highly more evolved. You could make a case it was something like that, and some people do, with these stories of ancient nuclear warfare and things like that. Could it have been that they weren't extraterrestrials, but they were, for want of a better term, they could have been, for all intents and purposes, they may have had the same skills and the technologies. So, a lot of this is sort of open to question and certainly open to interpretation. But, I think it's sort of worth looking at the interpretations that go down the sort of technology, higher entity pathway, purely and simply because, from our perspective today with our science and technology, a lot of it does make sense, by applying that kind of scenario to it.
Well, that's a really fascinating point you make. And to sort of follow down this line a little bit further, if you don't mind, well, one thing comes to mind, which is that when I hear about these tales of the gods coming down and developing civilization, I often am concerned that my 21st century mind is unable to interpret it in any way beyond the literal. And I know that humans have this tendency to anthropomorphize deity or divinity, and I don't know necessarily that these ancient cultures are describing literal, historical type events in these texts. They very well may be, and I'm not trying to make any judgments in asking this question at all. So that's one thing that comes to mind. And the other thing, I think, is that I have a concern, again, not that this isn't a valid theory of what occurred in terms of genetic manipulation and some sort of scientific development of humanity, but at least looking at it from where I sit right now, there's a concern of those who would prefer humans not be seen as evolved from apes, whatever the cost. You know, it doesn't matter if it's God that did it. It could be aliens. It can be whatever, as long as as evolution, as it's described by the Darwinists, is not valid. So I get a little concerned that that's like being thrown in. And then there's the third thing, which we'll probably talk about more later, which is the whole disinformation angle. So there's all of these things swirling around that really muddy the picture. And I'm just wondering how you sort of found your way through all of that.
Well, I mean, that's a good question, because the only way you can do it is hopefully to do so with like an unbiased mind. I mean, you're right that when you look at a lot of these ancient texts, you know, some people will take the story literally. Other people will say, well, they were trying to talk about things that they could understand from their own perspective, but, you know, they clearly weren't in full possession of the facts, because the facts as they existed, simply that the people couldn't understand it. They couldn't fathom what was actually going on. And of course, we know that a lot of ancient texts were deciphered or, you know, translated, and then they were translated again, and certain portions were deleted for political reasons and, you know, belief systems. And so there's no doubt that regardless of which side of the fence you sit on, we don't have sort of a full unexpurgated history of a lot of the early times and early civilizations. We have somebody's interpretation. You know, some of these ancient stories, as we know, were written, you know, centuries after the events occurred. They've been passed down and so on. And I think that's always an important thing to remember when we're dealing with anything like this, is to look at the facts, look at the evidence we've got, and offer theories and ideas and concepts, which is what I try to do. What I try not to do, and I hope I don't do, is, you know, sort of thump your fist down and saying, this is the answer. You know, all we can really do is present data and offer a case as to why logically we think this could be the answer, and present data in support of it. But I think the worst thing we can do is say, for sure, you know, it's like somebody saying, I know that aliens crashed at Roswell. Well, no, you actually don't. You come to a good conclusion based on the witness testimony, which is a very different thing. And I think, you know, we need to apply that to things like this, and particularly the further you go back in time, when, you know, the evidence is harder and harder to collect, and obviously there's nobody from that time frame left. That's why we need to sort of make a judgment as to how we're going to examine this kind of material, and what we're going to do with it, and how we present it. You know, that's an important thing.
You presented so much information in the book. I'm wondering if you had to pick one or two lines of sort of reasoning or historical facts that you present there that's most convincing in terms of what you're trying to point out here. What would you say that those are?
Well, you know, I think one of them, ironically, although the book, you know, deals with a lot of issues in the distant past, I think ironically one of the things for me that I do find really intriguing is the sheer number of people in ufology today who are H-negative, when, as I said, the percentage of the overall population is extremely small. I mean, to give you a sort of classic personal example, something I didn't know until the book came out. And, you know, it was highlighted and publicized. And, you know, this leads to Facebook. You know, everybody's got thousands or hundreds of friends in Facebook. Funnily enough, 3 of my old girlfriends, one straight out of school, one in my 20s and one in my early 30s, they're all RH negative. And, you know, I have no way, maybe that's coincidence, but it is kind of strange that somebody who writes books about UFOs, you know, of all the girlfriends I had in my teens, 20s and 30s, 3 of them were RH negative and not particularly interested. Well, one's actually interested in UFOs. The other 2 weren't, beyond the fact that they knew I was, because, you know, when we were going out together. But they were like, wow, you know, we never thought about this. And they contacted me like 10 years later, 20 years later to say, hey, remember me, you know, that kind of thing. And I'm RH negative. And that I kind of found that intriguing, because that sort of really hit home at like a personal level. You know what I mean? It was that was kind of, for me, it was unusual, but it was kind of a bit mind blowing as well, in the sense that, wow, this one girl, Sarah, she was RH negative, and, you know, okay, well, that's one. And then a couple of weeks later, one of the other ones contacted me, and then another one, and it was like, it was just odd, you know. It was just, I have no other way I can describe it. But I mean, that kind of personal aspect with the RH negatives today, aside from that, I think it's one of the things that interests me is arguably one of the most famous abduction stories of all time, the Betty and Barney Hill case of 1961, which I talk about in the book. And when the Hills were traveling home from a vacation in Canada and crossed the border back into the US, traveling back to their New Hampshire home, you know, saw this weird light, wasn't sure what it was. Was it a star? Was it a plane? And that's sort of the classic abduction experience: missing time, confusion, a sense that something significant happened, and then subsequent dreams and nightmares of seeing this object going on board, etc., etc. And when the nightmare started, the Hills decided to have regressive hypnosis. One of the things that Barney said when the so-called aliens were examining him, that they carefully ran their fingers up and down his spine, and he thought, with hindsight, they were counting his vertebra. Now, it's sort of little issues like this that, you know, this was 50 years ago, more than 50 years ago now, when Barney was talking about this. Nobody in ufology was talking about RH negative blood, and certainly no one was talking about people having extra vertebra. But it's little issues like this which actually, very often I've found, add credence to at a greater level than something that you might think is more significant. You know, just these little issues, like the alien supposedly counting his vertebra, you know, and then we find there is this vertebra issue. And of course, many abduction experiences are connected with genetics and reproduction, you know, just as you can argue with sort of the Cro-Magnons through to us. So it's things like that, you know, the little issues like the Hill encounter and the people in ufology, you know, being so intermingled and connected to the RH negatives, even if they're not directly themselves. So, you know, it's things like that when I put it together, for me at least, you sort of see a framework developing.
If we're talking about unidentified flying objects, abduction experiences, could you put that in a box? Like, what are we talking about? Are we talking about extraterrestrials or ultra-terrestrials or some sort of transdimensional entities, or is the mind more powerful than we realize? All of the above?
Yes. Well, what I would actually say is, I think, like a lot of people, if you get into the subject like I do when you're a kid, you know, everything's pretty much black and white, you know. Bigfoot's a giant ape, the Loch Ness Monster's a dinosaur, UFOs are piloted by aliens from this star system or that star system. But I guess like a lot of people, the more I've dug into it, you know, I began, and certainly this probably happened more when I was sort of in my mid to late 20s. I began to sort of see more beyond just the nuts and bolts angle and realize, you know, there were distinct crossovers between the world of ufology and a lot of paranormal activity. You know, issues that you would see in areas that a lot of ufologists today won't touch. I mean, for me, there are clear parallels between